Thank you. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm going to spend probably a little over an hour or so going through the concepts of GIS and geodesign. So this is a relatively new concept. GIS is not new. It's been around for more than 50 years. Dr. Roger Tomlinson, who some of you may have heard about, he coined the term GIS to describe a system built to manage the Canada Land Inventory. So Canada Land Inventory was this large project in the early 60s to inventory all land in Canada and classify it for suitability for agriculture, for forestry, recreation, a number of things for suitability. And they computerized it. They started out doing it manually, then they computerized it. And Roger was the guy who built the system, and he called it the Canadian Geographic Information System. And that was the first time the term GIS was used. Roger, just as a side point, some of you also know this, Roger passed away at the age of 80 this past February, while still working. He was still working as a consultant. The guy, he died with his boots on, and he was an amazing guy. Got an Order of Canada, and just a few months before he died, he was promoted to an officer of the Order of Canada for essentially inventing modern computerized mapping. And they said in his obituary, Google Earth wouldn't have happened without Roger's insight and vision. Geodesign is another concept that was, the term was invented by one of the very early pioneers of GIS, whose name is Bill Miller. He calls me his younger brother, so Bill's in his 70s now and semi-retired, but he is an unusual combination of an architect and an engineer. And he also was one of the very early pioneers in GIS, and he coined the term geodesign. And now there's multiple conferences around the world every year talking about geodesign. So I'm going to talk a little bit about GIS, but I'm going to focus mostly on how we would use GIS for design. I think those of you who have maybe have had a number of GIS courses are familiar with the basics of GIS, but the idea of using it for design is relatively new. Designers traditionally use design tools like AutoCAD or MicroStation or ArchiCAD or any number of tools that are specifically aimed at design. And one of the challenges with many of these design tools is they were created to work on files that will only go to a certain size. They never thought of designing the world. So they weren't designed to hold a database that would encompass a very large amount of geography. GIS, on the other hand, was designed to do exactly what Roger set out to do an inventory of land capability. So it's designed to describe the world. And in Roger's case, they had to do a whole bunch of overlay analysis. They invented the digitizing board during that project. One of his associates, Dr. Ray Boyle from the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, invented the digitizing tablet, which they used to digitize all of these maps. And in fact, I was at a conference a long time ago where Roger was describing the project, and he said one of their challenges was how do you digitize 15,000 maps with polygons of soils and forestry. And at one point they experimented with using prisoners at Kingston Penitentiary, and they abandoned it because it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. So I started actually, my very first job in this business in GIS was digitizing, and I'll tell you, it's back-breaking labor. You're hunched over that cursor, trying to trace out the map, and you couldn't just trace it. You had to actually choose the points. Software and hardware were pretty primitive in those days, so you had to choose the points that best described the curve, and there wasn't weeding programs and things like that. Anyhow, in fact, very early in my career, over 30 years ago, I gave a lecture to a presentation to the engineering staff at the company I was working for, a company called Marshall, Macklin and Monahan, and they were a multidisciplinary company. They did surveying, engineering, planning. In fact, they were one of the original multidisciplinary companies. They got started when E.P. Taylor, a famous guy who started Carling O'Keefe Brewery, I'm sure all of you have heard of Carling O'Keefe. He started that in the 1920s. He became very rich, and in the late 40s, he decided to take his vast estate in Don Mills and build a completely planned community, one of the very first planned communities anywhere in the world from scratch. and he built Don Mills. Some of you may have heard of Don Mills in Toronto. And he found two professors at the University of Toronto in the School of Civil Engineering, Oscar Marshall and Harold Macklin, and they had a graduate student, his name was Pat Monahan, and his younger brother was an undergraduate, Larry Monahan, and those guys were hired by E.P. Taylor to envision this huge community of 5,300 acres. And so Marshall, Macklin, and Monahan was born as a company, and they went on to do this work all over the world. And I spent 11 years with them and really learned the craft of design there. So things have changed a lot in the last few years, and as we now get CAD systems are getting more capable, and they can store larger and larger drawings. GIS, on the other hand, is becoming more and more CAD-like. The tools that you have in a GIS allow you to sketch. You can start doing things that a designer would do. You know, think about what a designer does. A designer begins with something that looks a lot like a piece of paper, and they sketch out a concept. You know, many of you have seen, you know, the napkin that was done in a restaurant by somebody famous who designed something. So designers start with concepts, and then they start to flesh out what they want to do. And so what we're going to talk about today is how you would actually start doing that with more knowledge about what exists. And you go through the process of not just creating something in isolation, but creating it in concert with nature. So let's get going. So design with nature is a very old concept. It's as old as humanity. People built their cities close to water because water was the best transportation. Maybe they built it closer to the camel routes. You know, the Silk Road, lots of were built up around that. Good views, so you could see the enemy coming, or maybe you wanted to be able to enjoy the view. But these cities, if they were well designed, thrived for centuries. We were just looking up in the 3D room at Rome, and Rome is still basically the same as it was when the Romans were there. It's got bigger, but it was an exceptionally well-designed city. It was in from the coast, so it didn't get hit by the typhoons. It didn't get, you know, feed the odd earthquake. But these old cities really were well thought through. They might have to be defensible quite often, you know, on high ground, maybe near water, or they took the sun into consideration and the wind. So the environment had a major effect on how these cities were built. And even the world's largest cities 2,000 years ago were not huge. Rome was astounding. Some people think there were 1 million people lived in Rome at the peak of the empire. And they built water systems, they built sewer systems, they really did a great job. Today, we have become capable of literally changing the face of the earth. And this guy here, Richard Neutra, was one of the very early pioneers of planning back in the 1950s. He was one of the first to state that you really needed, when doing planning, to take into account a lot of different things, not just what you wanted to build in the immediate site, but the environment around it, the economics of it. So he said community planning is an art, but one it needed a large scientific advisory board chaired by an expert in biology. And the word environment really hadn't emerged until Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in the early 60s, but here he was in the 50s talking about needing to consider biology and design and scientists, as well as the art of the design. So one very good example of design by a brilliant designer, some of you I'm sure have heard of this, it's called The Falling Waterhouse. It was Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece. So he designed it when he was 68 years old, and he was considered over the hill at the time. People figured he hadn't had a good design in quite a long time, and an owner of one of the most successful department stores in Pittsburgh, Edgar Kaufman, had made a vast fortune, and he decided to go to Wright and get him to design a summer house. He had this piece of land up in Pennsylvania. It was on the side of a mountain. It had a river going through it. So he commissioned Wright to design it. So Wright didn't do anything for 3 months. His staff thought he'd lost it. He just sat in his office and sort of read newspapers and did very little. And one day Kaufman was in New York, where his studios were, and said, "Hey, I'm in town. Thought I'd see how you were doing on the project." And Wright says, "Well, come on over around 2 o'clock. This is about 9 o'clock in the morning." So he grabbed all his staff and brought around. He had one guy sharpening pencils, one guy handing me erasers, another guy handing them different things. And he sat down and in 4 hours he designed Falling Waterhouse. And Kaufman came around and said, I love it, build it. And it's gone on to become one of the most famous pieces of architecture and design, especially design with nature. It just fits in incredibly well. He chose the slabs on it to look like the outcrops of rock in the mountains around there, the water running through it. The point that I'm going to make here in a minute, you'll see, is that after 40 some odd years, or maybe closer to 50 years of design, Wright was able in 90 days of thinking about this site, thinking about what Kaufman wanted, thinking about his family's requirements, thinking about the materials he was going to use. He had the whole thing in his head. And he just did a cordon in 4 hours. Today, that's a lot tougher to do, especially if you're designing a city. So this, we're looking here from a big tall building. Some of you may recognize this as Pudong, which is, and across the river is the Bund in Shanghai. So back in the early 1990s, I was approached by one of our customers, Liz Ottaway from the Oxford County. And she had been asked by this fellow, Edward Lehman, who is a planner, still in practice. His father, Alexander Lehman, is famous for being a world expert on megalopolises. So megalopolises are a phenomenon where two very large population centers end up resulting in something growing up in between them. So if you think of the Baltimore and Washington, they put the airport in between. And there's a whole bunch of industry growing up around that airport that serves both Baltimore and Washington. Here in Canada, Kingston is halfway between Toronto and Montreal. Red Deer is halfway between Edmonton and Calgary. Anyway, I digress. Edward had been hired by the Shanghai Construction Commission to design a new city across the river from the Bund, which was all rice paddies at the time. The goal was to accommodate 16 million people. And here it is 30 years later, and they've now built it. And when they started out, he said, well, there's no way we can just design this with traditional design. First of all, we don't have enough time. Big cities like Shanghai grew organically over centuries. And even the Bund dates back to the 19th century, and it grew up over the 20th century. So we started using geodesign techniques, early geodesign, using ArcInfo workstation on a Unix workstation to start mapping out not just what was there, that was mostly rice paddies, but what could be. So Edward worked with the Construction Commission for literally decades to build this out. And I was there and actually saw it back in 2009, and I actually shot this photo, both these photos actually, but that one was taken from up in a hotel, and you can see down here, look at that little building on the very lower left-hand side. That's that little tiny building in front of this giant tower. So even in just a few years, there's many more buildings than there were there in 2009. So I'm going to switch gears here. I think this gives you a sense of the context for geodesign and talk about what has given us some enormous design challenges. Now, the 20th century has largely been the fossil fuel century. It's the century in which fossil fuels enabled development on a scale that could not even be imagined. And who would ever think you could build a city for 16 million people in just a couple of decades? In fact, when you look at China, they've built an entire industrial empire in 30 years. Ultra-fast trains, huge cities, freeways, auto industry, vast manufacturing industry in a short period of time. But fossil fuels bring lots of challenges. They spill, they blot the landscape, they're pumping massive amounts of CO2 into the air. And we have some real challenges facing us now moving into the 21st century of what do we change? Because we can't just keep doing the same thing that we've been doing. Toronto is a good example of a city built on fossil fuels, sprawl everywhere. Longest commuting times of any major center in North America, longest average commuting times. And we haven't come to grips with the fact that we've built it out to the point where it doesn't work anymore. We need to do something different. What is it? The mayoral candidates in Toronto are arguing, is it subways, is it trains, is it better roads, better cars? My response to them would be, you're not using geodesign. You're not designing with what exists. So let's take a look at, continue with our fossil fuel story. This is an image, a little dark to see here, but it's the tar sands in Fort McMurray. And this is a false color image of it with the status about 2000. But this image is showing disturbances that have taken place between 1975 and 2000. So we're getting new tools that actually help us understand things. This is from a little application called Change Matters that's hosted free on the ESRI website. It's got all of the Landsat imagery from when the first satellites were launched up till today. And you can go in and do a number of things here. You can select dates and you can see what's changing over time. You know, the Landsat isn't perfect. It's 30-meter resolution, Meg 20 now. But it gives you a sense of what's happening around the world. So another big challenge we've got, once those fossil fuels start powering vast fleets of trawlers and we create massive things out there, we start getting enormous ocean overuse. This has got to be one of the biggest problems facing the world today, and probably the least talked about among the general public. They all talk about climate change, but the oceans are acidifying partly because of climate change, but mostly full of garbage. That's a garbage island down there. Brent and I were looking at yesterday how big is the biggest garbage island in the Pacific. Turns out it's 15 million square kilometers, 1.5 times Canada. We're almost twice the continental United States, an island of garbage. It's just beyond belief what we've been able to do in changing things. So nothing was designed. Think about the loss of the fishing industry in Newfoundland. Partly it was caused by climate warming, and the cod habitat wasn't quite so good, but it was mostly caused by the federal government funding dozens, if not maybe not hundreds, but several hundred trawlers that went out and just vacuumed all the cod up out of the ocean because they wanted to put jobs in all the outports of Newfoundland. Well, it lasted for about 20 years. Now it's gone for the next 100. So we really have to think very carefully about what we're doing with the oceans. Same thing applies to forests. Some very good ideas, like let's use biodiesel in Europe. They have a requirement for 20-some-odd% biodiesel in or 10% biodiesel in all their cars. But you know where that biodiesel is coming from? Palm oil. And what are they doing? They're slashing forests to build palm oil plantations. They're taking a diverse habitat that supports the poor orangutan up there, crawling over the deforested piece of land that supported him and all his other species around there. And this is actually deforestation for palm. You can see this going on here. This is just over like a 10-year period where it's being deforested for palm oil. So a really good idea. Let's reduce fossil fuel emissions by going with biodiesel, and it has a totally opposite effect. In fact, I heard a presentation from a guy from Indonesia who said that these palm plantations, when they burn off the forest, they don't even get the wood. They're just in such a hurry. They just burn them, but they've been there for so long. Some of these tropical forests, they're vast peat bogs. And some of these peat bogs are on fire for decades, and they're pumping far, far more carbon into the atmosphere than you would ever save by growing biodiesel. So let's move a little bit closer to our topic of planning, where we actually talk about planning. Urbanization is where planners really came into their own as we know them today in building planned communities, starting back in 1948, modern planning in Don Mills. The company went on to create an international group that went off to build all kinds of cities in Saudi Arabia. And we used to nickname them, when I was there, Don Mills of the Desert, because they plunked the curvy little streets with the cul-de-sacs down in the middle of the desert. What we're looking at here is, the idea of design, but my goodness, that's got to be an awful place to live. You're just, you're just in this huge urban sprawl, not very livable. There isn't probably much street life. And then these are in Florida, down here. The one down on the other side is Shanghai, and you can see how they accommodate that vast amount of urbanization. It's just row and row and row and row of identical high-rise. The one up on the upper left there and the one on the top are favelas. These vast slums that have built up on the side of mountains. The one up on the left is from Haiti, and the one here is in Rio. I actually visited one a couple of years ago. It was it a year ago? Yeah, it was just a year ago. Just in spring of 13, I went through one of the favelas in Rio, and it's just astounding. And in fact, if it wasn't for the violence and the smell wasn't actually all that bad. I would say this isn't a bad place to live, because there was street life. People were out in the streets. It had an organic sort of growth to it. The view was fantastic, because they build them up in the sides of mountains. But it gives you a sense of what happens when you do let things go organically, and when you maybe even over-plan. So one of the big challenges of this vast urban sprawl are things like this, where you just got to ask yourself, do you really want to spend your life sitting on one of those? One of our staff came to us this week and said her husband had lost her job in Toronto, and they were going to move to their cottage out in Peterborough, and she's been driving in for the last 3 months, 140 kilometers each way, taking her like 2 and some odd hours, and could I please work from home? So she's in a clerical position in our accounting department, so we're considering it, because who wants to live like that? And what is the real purpose of that, other than to just start? It probably started as a 4-lane road, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually, stuff like this just results in a collapse. There's a very good book, by the way, if some of you may have heard of it, by Jared Diamond. He's a geographer from Los Angeles that's written a number of books. His most famous is Guns, Germs, and Steel. But I think one of his best books is called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Succeed or Fail. And he talks about how everyone around can see it. Like everybody in the society says, we shouldn't be doing this, we're going to fail. But momentum carries them through to collapse. And I have a sense that if we don't change the way we look at the world, and the way we build things out, this will happen. My sister-in-law is a teacher, and she wanted to give kids in her class, geography class, an exercise in what's happened to growth in Toronto. So the exercise we ended up getting to do was put together growth patterns in Toronto. And I have a little animation of this here. I hope it actually works. It worked a couple hours ago. But this is now watching the growth from 1966 to 2000. And it's astounding. If you actually measure the red areas, it was 2.5 times the area covered between 66 and 2000. I'll just play that one more time, because it's actually worth seeing how much it grows. You can actually see the date going on up in the top there. But it's, that's class 1 farmland as well. So you're covering over some of the very best farmland, and it's just low density urban sprawl. And more studies are showing that urban sprawl, which is just these vast, 2,000, 3,000 square foot houses with a garage in the front yard, with nowhere to walk, you have to drive everywhere, are sort of soul-sucking places to live, that you don't have the street life. So if you look what's happening in Toronto, one benefit of poor transportation is everybody's moving into the downtown. And the density is rising. Places like Liberty Village are becoming magnets for young people. People are living and working in the same area. And in part, it's a response to this, the impossibility of getting from here to there. One of the big problems we have in our world is we hear about natural disasters. Somebody says there's, natural disasters are causing problems. Well, I've also heard people say there is no such thing as a natural disaster. It was a human that put themselves in the way of a natural event. So if you build on top of an earthquake zone, as this photo from Haiti shows, and you don't engineer for it, you don't design for it, part of geodesign is building your buildings so that they will survive a big earthquake. Or the tsunami in Japan, or the wildfires in Southern California, or in the Hurricane Sandy and the wildfires in Kelowna and stuff like that. All of these are a result of poor planning, ultimately. Whether it was 200 years ago that they didn't understand earthquakes, they didn't understand tectonic movement, today we do. Another big issue facing us is desertification. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about this. That photograph from the top is a fishing boat in the Aral Sea, where the Russians have created vast irrigation system to irrigate cotton fields. And they're one of the world's largest producers of cotton, but they literally drain the Aral Sea. So there's nothing there. These are encroaching deserts in the Sahel in Africa. In fact, this is in China. This is farmland in China. China's biggest problem today is desertification. If you look at where they fall on the latitude around the world, they're very marginal farmland. A little bit of moving the desert area north, which is happening under climate change, they're in huge trouble because they lose big chunks of their agricultural land. In fact, this is exactly what's happening to a lot of it. Poor farming practices, peasant farming. I did a project a few years ago to do a feasibility study for a rural land registration system in China. And the objective of the project was to give the individual Chinese farmers some rights on their land. They're just communist collective farms. And if you work hard and you become the best farmer in your collective with your acre of land, they say, oh, he's getting too high, drag him down, give him the worst land, and give somebody else's good land. And if they go off to work in a factory and come back 6 months later, their land's gone. So it's causing a lot of unrest, but there are some interesting statistics. Number one, there's about 250 million families on farms in China, 900 million people, and they're farming about 250 million acres, about the same as the United States. Half the productivity, so half the crop productivity, and mostly farmed by hand with hoes, and with very poor soil management practices. So this is what you see here happening when they don't manage their soil. And so the result is, I shouldn't spend so much time on this slide, but it's interesting. China is now leading the world in installation of solar and wind, renewable energy, because they've come to the realization that fossil fuels are could, if the climate changes the way everybody says it is, if we don't do anything, will wipe out their agriculture and wipe out their food supply. So their goal is to become one of the world's biggest superpower, but you can't do it if you can't feed your population. This one here is another personal touch on this one. That's Lake Chad, and you can see Nigeria in the lower left there. It's on the border of Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. I spent most of 1974 doing reconnaissance for the mapping for northeast Nigeria. I'd never been mapped before. And I went over there as just a young guy, 23 years old, to work for this old surveyor who ended up getting sick in the first 4 weeks, or first 2 months really, and left me there to run the thing. And it was what a fantastic experience. Got to see this whole area, going around looking for places to set up first order geodetic stations. So I ended up going up there and looking at the Lake Chad. That was 2 years after that. Look at it now. It's gone. It's down to a tiny fraction of its size as a result of climate change, mostly. But some of it has been just poor soil management practices. The Fulanis, who are the tribes, the houses in the Fulanis, but the houses are farmers who farm just above the desert, just up to the edge of the area that's too deserted to grow anything, and then above that they have goats and sheep. But the goats and sheep rip vegetation out. They don't bite it off. I grew up on a farm and we had sheep, and you couldn't leave sheep outside in the field for very long because they don't, unlike cows who bite the grass off, sheep rip it out. And so very poor for soil, and so you get this enormous desertification. A somewhat natural phenomenon, if you will, as a result of climate change, but this stuff sure isn't natural. Turning Palm Springs, whoops, what happened? That was me that did that.
It's the laptop button.
I guess I want to go back to the laptop, do I? Turning the desert green. I mean, still, there's 72 golf courses in Palm Springs, and they have no water. Hasn't rained in California for months. They're in the worst drought in the recorded human history in California, and it's a result of significant climate change. There's one of the more interesting things about climate is we don't know very much about it. We're learning an awful lot about it. But I have an acquaintance who's a historical climatologist who gave a lecture in Barrie earlier this year, and I've been subscribing to her newsletter for years. She says the Californians are hoping for rain, but she says I can tell them with a great degree of certainty there won't be any for 20 more years, because the Pacific Ocean has something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and it oscillates between warm and cool over a 70-year cycle, and the Atlantic's about the same. The Pacific right now is a multi-decade low temperature, and the Atlantic is in a multi-decade high. And that's exactly what happened when all the Navajos disappeared. It was a huge civilization 1,100 years ago, or around 1,100. And if you go down there and visit it, you can see these 6, 7, 8-story buildings made of wood and adobe. Some significant engineering went on to build those. Gone. All the people are gone because the water disappeared. All this geodesign isn't geodesign at all. I mean, they're just hoping that there'll be water somewhere. These center pivot irrigation, they're now down to 1.5 kilometers of wells trying to pull out water to water it. So, disaster. So, enough gloom and doom. What can we do about it? Well, some of you may have heard of Ian McCart. He wrote a very famous book called Design with Nature. And his whole idea was that, as he said this quote, we need to demonstrate creative rather than destructive skills if we're to replicate nature or manage it. So I think it's a bit arrogant of us as a society to think we can manage nature, but we've done so much destruction that in some ways we have to manage it back to an equilibrium that's going to work for us. He advocated a framework to help achieve this synergy with nature, and this is really a bit of a description of his framework. And the book is a very interesting book. It's a timeless book. It wasn't based on technology. It was based on concepts and ideas about how we somehow work in concert with nature. Which brings us to the whole thing that we're talking about today is geodesign. So, what is that? Well, one way to think of it is it's the intersection of geography, which many of you I'm sure are studying, and design, which some of you are studying. Some of you may be engineers, I saw a few hands went up. But we don't want to limit design to planners or engineers. Everybody's a designer. We all design our own lives. We design our families. Maybe sometimes they come by accident, but when you think about your life, you're at university getting a degree. You did that by design. You decided when you were in high school, I'm going to go get a degree. You chose your profession about where you're going to go. So you're going to decide where you're going to live. You're going to decide the kind of career you want. So even if you end up in a career where somebody tells you what to do every 15 minutes, like Ronald Reagan said, somebody asked him one time, what's it like to be the world's most powerful man? He said, thought for a minute, he said, that fellow that tells me what to do every 15 minutes, he's the world's most powerful man. So everybody is a designer. And if we look at the components of this, geography, which is the first part of it, is a science. It's not a thing of mere names, but of argument and reason of cause and effect. This is a geographer that said this in 1863. So geography helps us understand the world. It gives us a far better understanding. And in fact, it provides us even, if you will, a platform. And this idea of, we talk about a platform on which we do our work is becoming popular in the technology community. You talk about the Facebook platform or the Amazon platform or the Apple platform. But geography at its foundation is a platform for understanding the world better. People spend their whole life and don't understand studying geography and will never understand the world as an individual human. What GIS does, and this is what Roger Tomlinson's magic was he applied a technology to geography so that we could automate much of that analysis that we could never do before. And it really makes it come alive. It helps us to understand our world and build a knowledge base that we can use to then apply designs on top of that. So what is design? It's about our intent or purpose. We start out with an intent to create something. The creation of something better or beautiful or both. As the staircase replicating that beautiful spiral shell from nature. But it requires rapid iteration. All designs have to iterate. You need to do a redesign, you need to evaluate your design, you need to look at alternatives before you finally pick the one that works. We do that ourselves in our own life as we design our life. So one way to think of geodesign is it's using the same tools that you use in making maps and analyzing maps and designing things. So some of the most interesting, we all sit around a table and look at the table and we draw, we say, well, I don't like that, I like this, put the industrial here, put the commercial here, put the residential here. That's kind of going away a little bit as we are able to rapidly iterate with different designs. We can very quickly say, well, what if we put this in mixed use? What if we decided we want this many residential, this much employment places all in one spot? What's it going to look like? We can even go further and say how much tax revenue is it going to generate. We can say how loaded up are the sewers going to be. So the process of it is, it's a systematic way to let us do geographic planning and decision making, if you want to call it that. So GIS provides us with the knowledge of the world and a bunch of analysis tools. Design gives us this idea of creating and evaluating, until we finally come to something that we can then act on and build. So let's look at the first component of that, GIS. So I want to take just a few minutes here and look at what is changing. You know, what is happening to GIS. So this first slide should give you an idea with the little image of clouds here, that GIS is very quickly transforming from a system, that's what it stands for, Geographic Information System, which I put in my department to digitize my forestry maps, or digitize my parcel maps, or digitize my utility maps, and then decide where I'm going to cut trees, or decide how I should zone things, into a platform in some ways, if you will, like Amazon, like the Apple platform, where you integrate software and services together. So in the 1960s, Roger started with a mainframe. Then it very quickly moved in the 70s and 80s to mini computers. Then we went to things called workstations. Today, they've disappeared because a large desktop with a big monitor and multiple CPUs is a workstation. Then we moved to web servers. Then we moved into kind of a client-server architecture, and finally we're where we are today in clouds and devices. Just as an aside here, I read an article many years ago in The Economist magazine that described the cycle of computing. And the article at the time, this is in the mid-90s, was talking about Java. And Sun had invented Java. And Bill Joy, who was the chief scientist at Sun, said he was going to blow up Kate's Lock and on the computer industry with Java, because the concept was that you no longer had to run software on your PC and install it. You actually hit a web page and it downloaded the software to your browser and then generated the application. They pointed out that in 1950, IBM invented the mainframe and created Fortran, the formula translation programming language, and modern world of computing began. 1965, I forgot the guy's name, Ken Olsen. He was the founder of Digital Equipment, invented the PDP, the mini computer, the programmable data processor it was called, and that was born. That didn't kill the mainframe. In fact, the mainframe continued to grow and is still used to this day in banking. It's the backbone of banking. The mini computer hasn't gone away. They just renamed servers. Then in 1980, 15 years later, IBM introduced the PC. 1995, Sun launched Java, 15 years later. So the article said Java has about a good 15-year run, and in 2010 something else will come along, and it was the iPad. So we're now in, so the iPad and that concept of devices has got about another 15-year run. So you heard it here first, 2025, there's going to be something completely different. So what does this do that the old platforms didn't do? Well, and I don't want to call them the old platforms, because I told that little story about The Economist from The Economist magazine, because the new stuff didn't kill the old stuff. The old stuff just continued on doing what it did well. The new stuff enabled new things. So what is the iPhone and the iPad doing? Well, they're making us mobile. We now no longer are tied to our personal computer. We don't have to schlep along a big laptop that's hard to get connected to the projector. You know, we will be able to just whip. I could have done this on my phone, this exact same presentation. I could have just plugged in my phone, or if you have an Apple TV at home, you just hit airplane, boom, away you go. So that revolution is going to it's made computing pervasive. It's going to do the same thing for GIS. It's going to give us pervasive access to geographic knowledge. And that geographic knowledge is not coming from my files that I have sitting on my desktop computer. Yes, it will come there, it starts there. It's not coming from my database, my geodatabase. It starts there, but I have to publish a service. It comes from all these services in the cloud. So I'll have multiple organizations will each publish their own services. This is happening today. They're all publishing their own services. I connect to those services through the idea of a web map. And that web map is made up of multiple services who are all offering live data feeding into that. Then I can publish that and anything else. That's the big change. So it's leveraging a lot of different trends. Whether those trends are in measurement, I mean, there's lots of things happening in GIS. There's lots of things happening in measurement. I saw I was at the University of Calgary the week before last, and a guy showed this little device about this big around. It's about this thick, looked like the old-fashioned coffee cans. It's a LiDAR device for $2,000, and it's aimed at in-car navigation, so that they can actually. Google's running around with that big, car with the giant thing on the top of it. Well, that's like a $500,000 LiDAR. They're not going to go too far with that. But if you can drive the price down today to $2,000, it's also going to revolutionize the way that we measure things. And this is happening all over the place, whether it's GPS or whether it's unmanned aerial vehicles. These things are revolutionizing measurement. Data is being revolutionized, totally. No one would ever have imagined 20 years ago that we'd have as much open data as we have now. Nobody would imagine that we have as much data as we have now. And I think it's fair to say that none of us can imagine sitting here what's going to happen in 20 years. It's just going to be astounding. I was at the University of Calgary a couple of years ago visiting this company whose name escapes me right now. It's Cyberra. They're funded partly by the Alberta government and the Alberta Research Council. And their goal is to build the largest cloud computing center for big data in the world in Alberta. And they're going to bury it in the side of the mountain so it's secure. But they're bidding on being the data supplier and the analytical organization for something called the Square Mile Array. Has anybody heard of this thing? Square Mile Array? It's a radio telescope that's going to be built either in southern Africa or in a desert in the middle of Australia that's going to listen for extraterrestrial life. And it's a square mile of a radio telescope. It's going to, they can't compress the data because they don't know what's noise and they don't know what's signal. And so they're going to have to store this data for decades and decades to understand whether there's signals coming out of it. It produces a terabyte per second of data. And these guys are going to try to store it. Anyway, that's big data. Absolutely enormous big data. Lots of other stuff. So we won't need to dwell on that too much. But what it really means is that we now have pervasive access to things that traditional GIS, we built that and we still continue to manage those all over the world. In ESRI, in our company, we have over 400,000 organizations around the world using ArcGIS. In Canada, we have about 12,000. And they're producing maps and data which are more and more being published. In fact, a little over a year ago, we made our cloud technology, ArcGIS Online, available at no additional cost to every desktop ArcGIS user. So that means everybody who was sitting with an ArcView in their little consulting business making maps, suddenly with just a right mouse click could publish that as a web service. It would be posted up on the cloud. They could make its availability known, add some metadata, add some keywords, and suddenly it's searchable. Just like that. Very simple to do. So that and the whole world of apps, combined with we going beyond just vectors and images to all the kinds of things you see in there. Sensors, connecting to sensor networks. We've had a very interesting project for the last couple of years, the last 3 winters, in Kitchener, Waterloo, Brant County, Brantford. There were 6 in the Waterloo region, and one other who's escaping me, that are having their snowplows monitored every 10 seconds. So there's like 32 parameters coming from the snowplow, wing up, wing down, sander on, sander off, salt on, salt off. And the idea is to monitor whether they're correctly following the procedures for not putting too much salt into the water system. So you got to turn the sand off and turn the salt off as you go over a bridge, and not so that the sand doesn't go into the water. The first stage of this was to set up a data center in Toronto that would take this data from hundreds and hundreds of snowplows every few seconds and record it and do reports. The second phase, which is in planning now, is to start having that database control the salter and the sander, two-way communication. So the guy driving, he doesn't have to, you no longer leave the human in the equation as to whether to turn it on or off. Very interesting. So what this is doing from a human point of view it's completely transforming organizations. I see this every day. I was out at our user conference in Edmonton last week and visited the Alberta government. And they're just going through a radical transformation of government in Alberta where they're starting to share far more information. The new premier has just laid the law down. In fact, Alison Redford before him laid the law down that we cannot operate in these silos. We can't have the energy department approving stuff that the environment department doesn't agree to, that the natural resources department doesn't agree that we have the resources, or that we're disturbing the water. They're all in these little silos. And there's a guy has a company in Banff, that's Canmore, that has built his whole career around something called cumulative effects. And he has this great presentation that he says one disturbance of the environment by itself has no effect, minimal effect. It's very small. And then another one is very small, and another one's very small. So they all get approved in these little silos. Yes, you can build that building. Yes, you can clear cut that chunk of forest. Yes, you can drill for oil in that particular spot. But put them all together. He says you get up in the morning, you go look in front of the mirror to shave. Men shave. So you look in the mirror and you look pretty much the same as you looked the day before. And you look pretty much the same as you did the day before. But if you see a picture of yourself 20 years ago, a lot changed. And eventually you disappear. He says the same with the landscape. These cumulative effects are resulting in us heading towards disaster. So his solution, which is really shown in his diagram, is that every disturbance, every permit that's issued, everything that we do, everything that we design has to look at a much more holistic view. And that's where GIS is taking us. It's taking us into this, breaking down these barriers that exist between different workflows, between disciplines, between cultures. The culture of an engineer is kind of, let's just build her. A planner is, well, let's spend some more time designing and thinking about it. And engineers tend to also be site-specific. I can say it because I am one. And a lot of civil engineers are focused on making sure the bridge doesn't fall out, rightly so. The iron in this ring, this iron ring I'm wearing, came from one of the members of the Quebec Bridge that collapsed in 1908 and killed 150 people, because the engineers who designed the bridge were employed by the company that built it. And when the engineers realized that the design was flawed, the company said, just close your eyes, we'll keep going. We'll hope it doesn't fall down before we reach the middle. It was a cantilever bridge where it had to be stronger when it was being built until finally they met in the middle. Just before they met in the middle, it fell into the river and killed all these people. So the culture of construction and the culture of design were separated as a result of that. There was worldwide, it made a change in the way that engineering and design and construction were done. Again, go back 2 weeks ago to this conference I was at in Calgary. It was the Open Geospatial Consortium was celebrating their 20th anniversary, and they asked me to speak at the dinner. And I sat through one of their sessions, and I thought, what am I going to talk about that's going to be of interest to these guys? They just, you sometimes wonder. And as I sat through the sessions, they were just into this incredible amount of detail about how do I make this system talk to this system? How do I make this data format compatible with the other guy's data format? And the speaker after speaker was talking about all these challenges. And I had a bit of an aha moment just before dinner. You know what our problem is? We've made the data interoperable. We've made the systems interoperable. We have not made the organizations interoperable. They can't work together. But there's too much of a culture clash. There's too much of a, non-aligned objectives. And so that's what I did. It was only a 10-minute talk, and that's what I talked about. We need to bring our cultures together in a way that we can all work more holistically, because what we do, if we look at what GIS is doing for us, it's changing. It's changing us. It's changing the way we think and act. Because how does the world work? You can use this diagram for any profession. You start out by measuring something. You're sick, you go to the doctor, he takes your blood pressure, takes some blood, and he measures it. Then he analyzes it. Then he predicts what's going to happen to you. If you don't stop eating sugar, you're going to die, get diabetes. But it could be anything. And then we prepare, then we plan. When we got the plan done, then we design what we need to do. We evaluate the design iteratively. We act, and then we manage it. Then we start the whole cycle all over again. So this approach, if you will, is something that we have to embrace, that we have to make part of our whole way that we think, the way organizations think. And that's what really geodesign is about. One of the things that's helping us a lot in this area is the world is, we're getting a lot more realistic views of the world. We had just a fabulous demo just before we came down here at the 3D lab and looking at the whole world in 3D stereo. But there's more than looking at the world in 3D, it's analyzing the world in 3D and figuring out what we can do. There's lots of things on here talk about analytics, but to drill this down to a very practical problem, one of the big challenges that large cities have is how do you evaluate a condo? What makes a condo valuable? Floor space and being big is obviously helpful, but in a place like Vancouver, the view is everything. And the view, and I can go down the elevator and walk to the ocean, or I can walk to the subway, or I can walk to the Starbucks, or I can walk to the good shopping, or I can get on the SkyTrain and go out to the airport. So we've built out a database in Vancouver, 3D database of 45,000 units on the Vancouver Peninsula. It's an ideal lab because it's got ocean all around it, and the views of the mountains, you've got views of the ocean, you've got views of the inside. And for every window and every balcony, we've calculated the quality of view to about 10,000 points of interest. So some of them are parked, some right below them, some of them are the mountains off in the distance. And done that for every window and every balcony of every unit. And then assign a view value to it. We've done the same thing with sun. Vancouver sun's very important when the sun shines. In a place like Southern California, they want to be on the north side. In Vancouver, they want to be on the south side. All these together result in a new way to value property. Okay, enough about GIS. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specifics of geodesign. And we've talked about this a fair bit already, but I just wanted to give some context for this about what actually happens so this is a slide that's going to help us think about what geodesign specifically is. So all organizations, they get and manage information, and they call it data, or they call it information. They then do some analysis on that. So they analyze and assess this information, and then they do something with it. They design, they create or recreate goods or services. So all organizations do this, whether they do market research and they analyze the market and then decide I'm going to build this car, or I go out and I digitize all of the existing landforms and I analyze them for suitability for this and I design my community. In academia, information, we gather information, and we're the store of information. Universities are about information, truth, understanding, values, depends on the various disciplines. And then we also analyze that using critical thinking. We want to teach critical thinking in universities. How do I do analysis and assessment? How do I create knowledge? But then we also, when it comes to the design side, we want to teach people to do responsible creating. Envision something, design it, instantiate that design. In other words, build it. If we look at what GIS technology does to support us, it manages geospatial information, it analyzes geospatial information, and it does geodesign. So that's what geodesign, it supports the two that are above it. Okay, so so the whole thing together is the whole design process, or the one more button press there. So let's get down to a practical level. What does this really mean? Well, it means designing in a GIS. So some of you may have heard about ArcGIS Pro. It's a technology that we're about to release at the end of this year. In fact, it's in an open beta, so anybody that wants to take a crack at it can just download it onto their machine and start working with it. It's a rethinking of professional GIS in a number of ways. First, it's 2D and 3D. Secondly, it's actually uses all the modern hardware, 64-bit and all that stuff that you need to make something run fast. But a lot of it is about design. It's about making it easier to sketch. It's about making it easier to do analysis and run models. Because you want to really be able to take that idea of I sketch something, and then I go through something that is almost impossible for me to do in my head. Frank Lloyd Wright had it all in his head. But with the complexity we have, you can't get it all in your head. So you have this huge model underneath you running. And then you might even go so far as to generate something that you envision, and the ultimate goal is to make a better decision. So that's really the process of geodesign. So let's go look at an example of geodesign. So these slides, as I go through them, you'll recognize they're just basic GIS functionality. It's really just using a bunch of standard things. So all of you have heard about the disaster in Japan where the tsunami swept in and overwhelmed the Fukushima and the whole area around it. It was, I mean, I actually happened to be watching television right at the moment it happened, and they cut away to the news, and it was just shocking. I thought, this has got to be a movie or something that somebody made up, you know, watching this vast wave pushing stuff over, and it was a total disaster. It was just a disaster beyond anything that we could imagine, because this is a heavily industrialized area, heavily populated area. And it was in the native far inland, but of course the tsunami was caused by a magnitude 9 earthquake. So where the water didn't come in, there was this massive earthquake, and you saw enormous damage. In fact, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant was actually, the whole nuclear safety stuff worked perfectly. The plant shut down correctly. Everything worked exactly in the magnitude 9 earthquake, but 15 or 20 minutes later, in came the tsunami, and they were sitting right on the shore. They only had like a 5-meter seawall, and it was a 15-meter wave come in. Worse than that, they had their cooling pond, the cooling for the waste was up on the top of the buildings. The generators were in the basement, and they got wiped out. An unnecessary disaster, actually. But this is the exclusion zone, and you can see what another disaster it was. The challenge that the Bill Miller's team, and Bill Miller actually gave me these slides and told me about this story, and it just amazed me. That's the number of cubic meters, and each cubic meter represents about a ton or more of material. 2 million cubic meters from the tsunami and the earthquake, and 7.5 million cubic meters of material that had to be disposed of from the earthquake. So we're looking at over almost 10 million tons of material that had to be hauled away before they could start rebuilding it. One of the challenges is, if any of you have ever been to Japan, the roads are quite narrow, and they wind up through the hills. So it was a very difficult thing to get trucks through these small roads. So they had to say, okay, where are we going to put disposal sites? Well, we got to have the appropriate land use. We got to have the appropriate proximity to roads. We got to be near the tsunami, so we can, we don't want to have to haul it too far. We don't want to be near rivers and lakes for riparian sensitivity. We certainly don't want to be at all within 100 meters of them, because some of this stuff is toxic. And we want the right slope. We don't want it to be in too steep a slope. So these are all of the weighting of the criteria. This is all plugged into a geoprocessing model to provide the value. And the model was run. And the result was, here are all of the spots that are most suitable for disposing of this waste. So this is sort of step one of what they did. So you can see that they're ranked from the most suitable to the least suitable. And then the spots were chosen along with the number of cubic meters that each site could take. Then we're looking here, that's a little bit more detail of the sites. Some of them were staging sites, some of them were docks, just getting more detail on it. And even more detail, these were the debris locations. You can see the notes down at the bottom there. So next thing was all this housing was destroyed. And you needed temporary housing for literally millions of people to be done in a relatively short period of time. So once again, a similar thing. This is the region, and that's where the earthquake was. And there's Sendai, which was the center of the auto manufacturer. Honda had a large plant there. So some of you may have heard that Honda was shut down for 8 weeks. Another little anecdote off to the side here. I was in Germany this summer visiting Daimler. And they're using GIS for insurance. They've mapped every location in 80 countries, every Daimler location, for risk. And they use them to evaluate the risk to them of that supplier. And in Sendai, there was a supplier of some obscure part, the only supplier in the world of that part, and they were a supplier to one of Daimler's suppliers. And it shut down production of the S-Class Mercedes for 8 weeks. Well, they found another supplier. And so they're now going into a geodesign exercise of looking at how do we design our supply chain better to be more resistant to this kind of risk. So if we look at there's the exclusion. So these are people in shelters. So you can see here that the red areas, there's greater than 10,000 people in shelters in each of those areas. So this is the population. You also see the exclusion zone. So this is again a set of criteria that people sat down and said, okay, we got to be, the distance to the tsunami zone was one criteria. And you can read all this: major roads, built up areas, open space, slope, distance. And you want to exclude the radiation zones, the flood zone itself, and the existing built up areas where there was no room to build. So you can see the blue along the edge, that was the tsunami inundation zone. So you can see it went a long way in. It was like kilometers back inland in places, because we're looking across the entire island here. So this model then was, let's put a buffer around the tsunami zone, and it's a variable buffer. So, the worst place for housing all the way to the best place for housing, at least from the criteria of away from the tsunami. Then we look at the street network. Where do we have roads that we can actually move people through, move building material through quickly, move prefab? They just said they had to be fast, so they had to put up prefab houses. So once again, ran a model which resulted in the best to the worst places to locate these temporary housing. Once again, urban areas. Where are these? These are the urban areas. These are built-up areas. What do? We need a model to get buffer around the urban areas, and the result is we put buffers around these urban areas. Those are the worst places. These are the best places. We need to be relatively close to these urban areas that had the disaster, because people still have jobs that they have to get to. They still have schools to go to if they're still standing. So if we zoom in a little bit on the Sendai area, we can actually see, this is a land use map showing farmland and what is good. Like farmland and golf fields are good, but undeveloped is the best. Rice fields are poor, too wet. Water is excluded. Built-up areas are excluded, and so on. That results in yet another model running, and here's the result of the model, which is the available open space. So the best open space. So finally, we look at slope. We don't want to be too big at slope, so we run yet another model. We come up with a slope map, and then we go and we say, okay, let's now, here's the exclusion zone. There's the tsunami exclusion zone, the nuclear exclusion zone. Let's put a buffer around that. We now have the areas that are excluded. We now put it all together in this great big huge model and run the entire thing, and the result is combining all of those different layers together in a weighted overlay with the exclusion zones, resulting in a housing suitability map. And here's the housing suitability map. And this had to be done literally in days, because collecting the data, it turned out just collecting the land use information was quite a challenge. Different organizations had different bits of information. So this is a good example and we'll zoom in here a little bit on a smaller area. You can actually see the detail of where the best places and the worst places to put it are. So this is an example of emergency response. We immediately got to go in and we've got to really design a completely new community, overnight temporary community. And of course, the design process is going on in that area today as they redesign the destroyed infrastructure and make it more resilient. In fact, that's one of the goals of geodesign, is to make places more resilient so that we don't have those natural disasters, the not natural disasters. Okay, well, let's finish off with just a couple of more things. One of we talked about that thing in Vancouver about us digitizing all those buildings, but one of the byproducts of that is actually how do you design them to be better? How do you make buildings better neighbors? Nobody likes to buy a condo with a beautiful view of the ocean to discover that you just bought, there's land right beside you where there's another condo can pop up. So being able to calculate the views and be able to look at the shadows of other buildings and the sight lines, and really being able to effectively make things more livable. Some of you have heard of City Engine. It was a technology that ESRI bought a few years ago that was really designed for making scenes for movies. It generated realistic scenes for movies. But the organization had used ArcGIS, this company had used ArcGIS to do cities. For instance, the movie Cars 2, all the scenery was generated with City Engine. But they used ArcGIS to lay out London. and then put in all this, a few spots where, like St. Paul's Cathedral and the stuff that was immediately recognizable was dropped in, but all the rest was generated automatically through procedures or parameters. So that you can quickly just change the parameter and poof, and it's literally a couple of seconds. You said, I want that to be only 5 stories, and I want this to be 20, and it regenerates it. So the idea of being able to do rapid iteration within the geography, being able to then look at the different sight lines and look at different, I won't show it to you here today, but we have, in that Vancouver scene, we took all of the zoning, which is how high can the buildings go, and we calculated for every building in the entire city how much higher they could go. So what's the total development space? And the development community just absolutely loves it. So you can see a little bit more here. All right, I want to finish off with just a couple of thoughts. Number one is that we're going through an energy transformation in the world that we haven't gone through for 100 years. We realize that we can't use fossil fuels anymore, and even if we could continue to use fossil fuels, they're expensive. It's getting harder and harder to find oil. Fracking makes it environmentally damaging, but it's also expensive. It's expensive to melt tar into oil and upgrade it and stuff like that. So we've got this enormous opportunity facing us as a civilization to rethink our whole energy network, and that's going to be something that will transform us totally. It'll be complete. I think it'll be completely renewable, sustainable. I get offers coming in fairly regularly to meet with people they're doing interesting things in energy. I got a thing yesterday from my CFO, got a note from his brother-in-law that this company in Orangeville, of all places, has invented a battery that can use aluminum, even waste aluminum. And this is just interesting because as a kid we used to talk about Kitimat. They showed Kitimat, the big hydro plant that was built in northern BC to smelt aluminum, because aluminum could only be smelted when I was a kid near a massive electrical facility, because it takes huge amounts of energy to make a block of aluminum. Well, it turns out that block of aluminum has massive amounts of energy stored in it. And if you oxidize that aluminum in the right solution, it gives off huge amount of energy. So a block of aluminum is a battery. So this company in Orangeville has figured out how to get both energy and hydrogen out of it, 99.97% pure hydrogen out of waste aluminum. And when the oxide's done, you send it back and make aluminum again. So they're planning to use it on wind turbines. So the wind blows, it actually generates aluminum as the wind's blowing. The wind's not blowing, it creates aluminum oxide, it creates electricity. And just if you think that this is just me making this up, the International Energy Agency, part of the US government, said that annually between 2010 and 2050, we'll need 55 new coal-fired plants with zero emissions, 32 nuclear plants, 17,500 wind turbines, 215 million square feet of solar panels every year. Every year. So by 2050, zero emission buildings. In fact, we're already well on our way to buildings that actually are energy positive. In other words, they generate more energy than they use, with things on the side. $62 trillion in 2010 dollars to generate this new energy infrastructure. As I say at the bottom here, this is a huge geodesign opportunity because it's going to change the way we think. Electric cars, they estimated there'll be 1 billion battery or hydrogen cars by 2050. And they'll be parked in the basement, both being charged and being discharged. Cars are only driven about 2% of the time. The rest of the time they sit in the driveway or a parking spot. Agriculture. Revolution happening in agriculture. The green revolution fed the whole world. Let us get to 7 billion. But a lot of it's unsustainable. It's using water, and it's using fossil fuel energy, and it's using fertilizer that's just not sustainable. So there's going to be a lot more focus on local sustainable agriculture. This little poster from Peel Region is where can I buy local food at Peel Region. And finally, we got to prepare for a changing world. We're seeing this already. Our world is going to be a different world by 2050. Even if we switch to a zero carbon environment, there's still an awful lot in the atmosphere. And maybe the climate is in part changing naturally. We got to get used to that. the two oceans changing all the time. So this is a huge challenge for all of you. You're just starting, many of you are starting in your career, and I wish I was 20 again and be able to see this whole thing unfold over the next 40 or 50 years. So